J.D. Vance mopped the floor with Tim Walz last night, despite it being another 3-1 debate. I want to make clear at the beginning, I like football coaches. I do. Urban Meyer was on the show this week. I do like football coaches. That football coach doesn't need to be anywhere near the Situation Room. Now, I've got a lot to say about this, but how bad was Tim Walz? Let's go and talk to Abby Phillips, Dana Bash, and Jake Tapper doing a post-debate breakdown on how bad was Tim Walz, cut number 31.
I think there was a clear lack of preparation and execution here on Walz's part.
I think actually it's the opposite. I think he had too much preparation.
Maybe, yeah.
He had so many lines that he was clearly trying to say that he didn't listen and said when J.D. Vance said one of the many things he really hit Kamala Harris on, not Tim Walz, but Kamala Harris, he didn't respond because he clearly had things in his mind. I think the lack of interviews that he has done with national media, with local media, it showed. He needed more reps.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, J.D. Vance is much more experienced at this, at public speaking, at defending himself, at pivoting.
It's not because J.D. Vance has been in the Senate for 2 years. It's because Tim Walz is kind of a buffoon and doesn't know anything, and we know that, and you know that, and boy, did it come out in the... Remember, this occurs hours after Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles at Iran. Luckily, Iran's Iron Dome and the assistance of U.S. destroyers in the region prevented great loss of life. One Palestinian man was killed, and 2 other Israelis were injured. And there will be a massive response from Israel somewhere, and it should have dominated the entire debate, along with China. China apparently, Xi Jinping, its general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, is apparently Voldemort and cannot be named by any of the networks because they all have business ties. Not one question on China. They're threatening Taiwan. They're threatening the Philippines. They have the most massive military buildup in the world. In the ABC debate and the CBS debate, did not have one question about China's malign intentions on the world stage. They didn't bring up Russia and Ukraine. They didn't bring up anything but except the first exchange because of the day's news. They had to shoehorn in something about Iran and Israel. So they did, and Tim Walz gives this answer, cut number 2, to start the debate.
Governor Walz, if you were the final voice in the Situation Room, would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran? You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you for those joining at home tonight. Let's keep in mind where this started. October 7th, Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,400 Israelis and took prisoners. Israel's ability to be able to defend itself is absolutely fundamental. Getting its hostages back, fundamental, and ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But the expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there. You saw it experienced today, where along with our Israeli partners and our coalition, able to stop the incoming attack. But what's fundamental here is that steady leadership is going to matter. It's clear, and the world saw it on that debate stage a few weeks ago, a nearly 80-year-old Donald Trump talking about crowd sizes is not what we need in this moment. But it's not just that. It's those that were closest to Donald Trump that understand how dangerous he is when the world is this dangerous. His chief of staff, John Kelly, said that he was the most flawed human being he'd ever met. And both of his secretaries of defense and his national security advisors said he should be nowhere near the White House. Now, the person closest to them, Donald Trump, said he's unfit for the highest office. That was Senator Vance. What we've seen out of Vice President Harris is we've seen steady leadership. We've seen a calmness that is able to draw on the coalitions to bring them together. Understanding that our allies matter. When our allies see Donald Trump turn towards Vladimir Putin, turn towards North Korea, when we start to see that type of fickleness around holding the coalitions together, we will stay committed. And as the Vice President said today we will protect our forces and our allied forces, and there will be consequences.
All right, so everyone watching immediately knows he doesn't have any idea what to say. He's got some lines prepared that he wants to get out about Donald Trump. He does not answer the question. He mixes up the terms. He has no clue. Let's cue Senator Vance. Cut number 3.
Senator Vance, the same question. Would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran? You have 2 minutes.
So, Margaret, I want to answer the question. First of all, thanks, Governor. Thanks to CBS for hosting the debate. And thanks, most importantly, to the American people who are watching this evening and caring enough about this country to pay attention to this vice presidential debate. I want to answer the question, but I want to actually give an introduction to myself a little bit because I recognize a lot of Americans don't know who either one of us are. I was raised in a working-class family. My mother required food assistance for periods of her life. My grandmother required Social Security help to raise me, and she raised me in part because my own mother struggled with addiction for a big chunk of my early life. I went to college on the GI Bill after I enlisted in the Marine Corps and served in Iraq. And so I stand here asking to be your vice president with extraordinary gratitude for this country, for the American dream that made it possible for me to live my dreams. And most importantly, I know that a lot of you are worried about the chaos in the world and the feeling that the American dream is unattainable. I want to try to convince you tonight over the next 90 minutes that if we get better leadership in the White House, if we get Donald Trump back in the White House, the American dream is going to be attainable once again. Now, to answer this particular question, we have to remember that as much as Governor Walz just accused Donald Trump of being an agent of chaos, Donald Trump actually delivered stability in the world, and he did it by establishing effective deterrence. People were afraid of stepping out of line. Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching against our allies and, God forbid, potentially launching against the United States as well. Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed to recognize that if they got out of line, the United States global leadership would put stability and peace back in the world. Now, you asked about a preemptive strike, Margaret, and I want to answer the question. Look, it is up to Israel what they think they need to do to keep their country safe, and we should support our allies wherever they are when they're fighting the bad guys. I think that's the right approach to take with the Israel question.
I think that may be the best answer in any debate I've ever watched. Introduce yourself, set up the stakes, defend your running mate, answer the question, go back to Israel, say yes. If they need to do what they need to do, they do it. It got better throughout. JD dominated from start to finish. There were silly question after silly. I think we had 3 rounds on abortion and 2 rounds on childcare. The world's on fire, and we had 3 rounds on abortion, 2 rounds on childcare. I have 3 important takeaways for you this morning. Number 1, Senator Vance is a superb debater and a very reassuring figure on the national stage, and he will continue to be. Second, Tim Walz is not. He represents the one big decision that Vice President Harris has had to make since Joe Biden dropped out. One time, she had one job, pick a vice president, and she made a terrible decision. Imagine her cabinet and her White House staff, if that's the best she can do. She's going to go back to San Francisco and bring in all these lunatic lefties like Tim Walz. Third, and this is really the most important thing, legacy media is irretrievably broken. CBS, ABC, NBC, they cannot be reclaimed. They have lurched into rote leftism, extreme partisanship, and they cannot pull back to an even minimum level of seriousness on big occasions. Do the executives at these networks not see what has happened? Americans do not trust their news divisions at the legacy networks. It's as if they are run fresh from the college campuses of America by interns as well as hardened partisans from the Obama years. The CBS debate was not as bad as the ABC debate, but really, the world tuned in only hours after Iran, the head of the snake, launched 180 missiles at our ally Israel. Nora O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan spend 10 minutes on it. They spend 10 minutes on 10 million people coming into the country. They gloss over the fact that the Biden-Harris administration has completely failed the people of North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia. And then 3 rounds on abortion, which we talked about in the last debate, and about which presidents have no control. It belongs to the states. And then we went to child care. It's just so shocking how bad it was in terms of the CBS organization. I don't think a Republican should ever go on another Sunday show. I know Lindsey Graham will. He loves them. I know that they'll go down to 1 million. They'll keep doing it. They've got legacy obligations to do so. But what a farce. Not one question on China's vast military buildup, its threat to Taiwan, the Philippines. No, nothing about the Houthis firing at our ships every day. Nothing at all. It's unbelievable to me that they were that bad, but J.D. Vance was that good. Let me spend 1 minute talking to you about the debate last night. 3 rounds of questions on abortion. Now, I've done 5 debates. 4 with CNN, 1 with NBC. They were GOP presidential primary debates. I was the conservative in the room, and I kept reminding people, are we going to talk about late-term abortions? Are we going to talk about born-alive bills? Are we going to talk about 6-month, 7-month, 8-month abortions? Or are we just going to frame it as the left likes to frame it? And I made headway when I was in the room, but obviously there were only left-wingers in the CBS room. All 3 rounds, left-wing framing about abortion, which also came up in the ABC debate. There is no reclaiming legacy media. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. They are all run by leftists who believe in leftist ideals. They frame every question like leftists, but especially abortion, which the late Rush Limbaugh referred to as a sacrament of the left. We will never get an honest discussion about abortion. J.D. Vance did a fine job trying to reframe the question last night, but I want you to focus on the fact that they dare not have a good discussion of abortion. I would welcome it. I would welcome it, as would every pro-lifer in America, as J.D. Vance tried to say. But we're never going to get it because the left is afraid of it, and the legacy media has been overrun by leftists from college campuses. They burrow in, they stay, they never leave, and for whatever reason, the leadership of the networks and their corporate owners are afraid of saying, the emperor has no clothes. We're all left-wing and we are losing our audience. We've lost our credibility. What are we going to do? They're afraid to do that. That's too bad. Now, I do want to go to a second bit of the debate. I'll do that in the next segment with Matt Continetti on a variety of things. Mostly J.D. Vance is to be praised for returning again and again to the fact that Kamala Harris is the incumbent. Joe Biden he was being very nice. Joe Biden is incapacitated. Kamala Harris is responsible for the fiasco in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, but it occurred on the day of an intercontinental ballistic missile attack on Israel, and they spent 10 minutes out of 95. I'm just astonished. I have to drive a long way today from Mid-Coast down to Portland to the University of Maine Law School. So, Matt Continetti, I am hoping that the commentary gang gets their podcast up and out early. Can you make me that promise?
It's ready for you now, Hugh. We recorded it
right
after
good,
the debate
good.
last night.
Oh, you did the emergency pod last night? Okay.
As soon as you're
Matt,
done,
you
can
are the
download
author
and
of, I'm going to download commentary and it will be ready for me. You are the author of the book, The Right. You are the author of the forthcoming book, The Good and the Bad. But mostly you are a very, very objective observer of things like we watched last night. And I got to just ask you at the beginning, do you know who the running mates for Franklin Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie were in 1940?
I do not.
Henry Wallace, the most left-leaning nominee of a major party until Kamala Harris came along, and the guy from Oregon, McNary. Now, if those two had been debating, do you think Germany's invasion of Poland might have come up? And do you think maybe Japan's invasion of China and Japan's threat to the United States might have come up?
Well, if the anchors from CBS News were moderating the debate, Hugh, neither of those issues would have come up. And I think what we saw last night in the debate that was very good for the Republican running mate, J.D. Vance, it was another case of 3-on-1, where the moderators interjected themselves into the debate despite saying at the outset that they weren't going to. And it led to some kind of absurd moments. But Senator Vance clearly rose above them, and I think demonstrated command and fluency from the get-go.
Oh, it was very impressive. But I'm almost near despair about American media, Matt. I've been a critic for a long time, but it's fallen into utter disrepute. It's as though Xi Jinping is Voldemort, and he must not be named by CBS, ABC, or CNN. Let me borrow a line from John Podhoretz. Am I taking crazy pills?
You're not, Hugh. What struck me while watching the debate last night and becoming annoyed with the moderators was that I think there might be a difference between the network anchors and the cable anchors. We've had 3 debates this season. The first debate was moderated by Jake Tapper and Dana Bash of CNN, and I thought they've done the best of the 3 mainstream media moderating teams. The other 2 debates, one was ABC and the other was CBS. The CNN anchors, despite having bias, we know about the CNN, they actually kind of had a better grasp of what politics is about today. I think they kind of understand what issues are being discussed in the nation's capital, what issues are more important to voters. The network anchors, I think, are kind of removed. I think there's a bubble within the media bubble. And if you're not actually in the fray every day, as the cable anchors are, you are completely lost and kind of at sea on your little liberal bubble ship. And so I think when we look at debates 4 years from now, we have to take a serious look at moderation. And I was just musing to myself this morning, maybe we can get AI to moderate the debate. I mean, maybe we should just come up
Siri
with
would have done a better
AI
job last
moderator.
night.
Yeah.
They could have spent 90 minutes on Iran, on 10/7, on Hezbollah, on Lebanon, about America's role in the world. They could have spent 90 minutes doing what all of the world had been focused on, which is that was a major world event yesterday, Matt. It's like if they had held the debate on the day that Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and they hadn't brought it up except for 5 minutes. Now, I want to explain. So I've
Ukraine
done 5
wasn't mentioned
debates.
either. We should point out, right? Ukraine wasn't mentioned at all.
Not once. And Ukraine is J.D. Vance's, Achilles
kind of a big
heel.
Story.
Yeah. I have done 5 debates with networks, 4 with CNN, 1 with NBC. I know that they are massive productions. It's not just the moderator's fault. The head of the network comes, the head of the news division comes. There are 30 to 50 people involved, and the bubble is almost 100%, unless someone like me shows up, gets inserted like Mary Catherine Ham, is almost all rote left wing. They are no one like you, Matt. And Commentary Magazine's kind of neocon, center left, center right, not conservative, not natcon, nothing like that. Normal. Nothing like that is in the room. The question set, 3 rounds on abortion. Even 1 round would have been too many, but 3 rounds on abortion, Matt?
Well, and let's not forget the 10 minutes spent on childcare. The economy came in a weird way. It wasn't about jobs. It wasn't even about rising prices. J.D. Vance had to go out of his way to mention them, and I think he did so effectively. But it was about housing, which is an issue. I would just say that I have a test, and I think I've told you about it before, Hugh, which is the climate change test. And I stop taking moderators seriously when they bring up climate change, which is an issue that is huge in the media bubble, but not really discussed or of a high concern to
Ever.
American. Right.
Ever.
And so what did these moderators do? They brought up climate change in the second question in relation to the devastation wrought by Hurricane Helene. And now I think there are a lot of questions involving Hurricane Helene. There's questions about preparedness. There are questions about what went wrong that created this awful devastation. There are huge questions about what the Biden administration and Vice President Harris are doing right now to help the victims of Hurricane Helene. But climate change, that is not a primary or secondary issue in my mind in concern to this devastation wrought by the hurricane. But that's what the moderators did on question 2. And so from that point on, I said, well, it's 3 on 1. And the remarkable thing, though, Hugh, and I keep emphasizing this, but I will continue to do so, is that J.D. Vance was unflappable. He was unflappable. He never lost his cool. He responded to the moderators, I think, very effectively. And he pointed out, look, you said you weren't going to fact check us, but now you're trying to fact check me. So let me fact check you. And of course, he had the facts in his pocket. He knew what he was talking about, unlike the moderators.
And he did not get angry.
Viewers will see. And he did not get angry.
He did not get any. Now, Matt Continetti, the second question in the ABC News debate was about abortion. They had 3 questions on abortion, 2 questions on child care, and then we ended with J6. Do you think Liz Cheney helped them plan the debate? I really have no idea how they ended up with this question set that ignored China and Ukraine, the DOD, Chinese spies in New York, Turkey bribing. By the way, I listened to the commentary pod about Eric Adams, and I kept saying, what's it tell us about Turkey? Forget about Eric Adams, he's a moron, but what does it tell us about our NATO ally Turkey that they're bribing our elected officials? There's a spy in the New York governor's office. The Chi-Coms are everywhere in the country. Are we just fundamentally an unserious country now?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the answer is pretty close to yes on that question, Hugh. I mean, I look at it from the foreign policy dimension, and you think about how, for the past year, the Biden response to all of the turmoil in the Middle East is don't escalate, Israel. Don't respond, Israel. Take the win, Israel, in April after Iran attacks you directly for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic. And what's happened? Chaos. An arc of chaos stretching from Ukraine down through the Red Sea in the Gulf of Aden. And, as you've been pointing out on the show, a much more belligerent China in the South China Sea. So, unfortunately, this administration is not serious. And I think the connections between this administration and the mainstream media are very real. And so the mainstream media also reflects this unseriousness. There wasn't one question about the current president, Joe Biden. What is his condition?
You came to my next question. It's obvious that the current president is incapacitated and that the current vice president's constitutional duty is to convene the cabinet to discuss that. He can be present in doing so. Ought that to have been asked last night?
Absolutely. I mean, when you consider Biden's response to the hurricane, I think the hurricane is a huge issue. We have 3 issues that are of real pressing concern right now. We have a war in the Middle East where we need to stand with Israel against Iran and take this opportunity to end the Iranian nuclear program and really pressure that regime to the point of where I think the Iranian people will collapse it themselves. We have the hurricane and Hurricane Helene and these communities in the Southeast that have been absolutely devastated. And we have this dock workers strike that just began 40 days before an election, interrupting global commerce, raising energy prices potentially amidst this turmoil in the Middle East. Where's Joe Biden? He was at the beach. And then when he's asked about what he was doing to prepare for the hurricane, whether he's in charge, he gave this kind of peevish answer where he said, well, I was on the phone for 2 hours. So of course everything's under control. And then when he was asked about Israel's retaliatory strike against the Houthis in Yemen, he thought that the reporter was asking about the dock workers. And so he said, well, I hope the sides can come together and reach an agreement. This is a major concern, I think, for most Americans. Who is in charge?
Well, and American sailors are under fire every day in the Red Sea. Every single day, and it didn't come up. Big question before I keep you for an off-air segment, Matt. What was the consequence of that debate on the election? I think Hugh Hewitt thinks it might have moved Pennsylvania decisively towards Trump, but what do you think?
I think it could have a small effect on the election. You know, of course, the conventional wisdom is that people don't vote on the basis of vice president. But the conventional wisdom before June was that debates don't really matter. And of course, the first debate between Trump and Biden mattered hugely. So this debate might matter as well. I think people come away from the debate with 2 reactions, Hugh. The first is J.D. Vance is a perfectly plausible president. And he made, I think, a lot of people reevaluate maybe their preconceived notions of who J.D. Vance is. And the second reaction is Tim Walz is a completely implausible vice president and president. And I think that could hurt the Harris ticket because Harris has really made only one major decision as a candidate for president. And that was her vice presidential selection. And clearly, based on last night, we can conclude she chose poorly.
I spent 3 weeks with the NBC folks. Lester and Kristen, of course, were my co-moderators for the GOP debate. And you'll end up doing these, I think, in the future. I'm aging out of this space, and you're serious enough and respectable enough to do it. You'll be amazed. They get everyone from the top of the network to the head of the news division to 40 people. You'll be amazed. 12 rehearsals, dress rehearsals. question meetings. It's absurd how much effort goes into this when artificial intelligence could do it. Is there any saving network news?
No, I don't think there's any saving network news. I think our best hope lies in diverse media sources. I don't have any experience in debate prep or organization, Hugh, as you do, but my colleague, Eliana Johnson at the Washington Free Beacon, participated in the News Nation debate of the Republican primary candidates earlier this cycle.
Did a wonderful job.
Yep. And I think they did a wonderful job. I think Eliana and Megyn Kelly did a wonderful job. And we're living in a media environment now where these debates command huge audiences. I'll be very curious to see how many people tuned in last night. But there's so much media. There's so much content to consume. There are so many ways a candidate can interact with the media or with the audience that I think the impact is kind of dispersed. And so we have to look toward alternatives, figure out how we can create debates that go around the mainstream media, because I think our experience this cycle shows that they are beyond safe.
They're shattered, and I think podcasting is probably, like blogging was the first blow, then Twitter X came along as the second blow, Facebook, Instagram, and the third blow is that serious people get together and talk about serious subjects, as with the Commentary podcast, so that you actually learn something and you get a diverse group of people, and someday some podcast will emerge that has a serious, someone like Andrew Sullivan talking with someone like you on a daily basis. It will emerge where there will be a left-right kind of serious conversation. But it's done. It's finished. And I don't know who's going to pay any money for it. Do you?
No. I will say this. So much depends on the candidates, too. And I think despite the moderation during the CBS debate last night, J.D. Vance did a very good job. And the conversation was civil. And it was actually kind of surprising the extent to which both candidates played nice. They said that they agreed. They wanted to focus on policy. It was a very different sort of debate than the ones that we've been used to. And so I think there's an appetite for debates like this. I think candidates, if you have the right people, can perform in debates like this. The question is the forum. Where did they come together? And for many years, we had the Commission on Presidential Debates. That kind of collapsed based on the experience in 2020. This cycle, 2024, we thought, okay, we'll bring candidates together. The candidates will make arrangements with networks and they'll decide and negotiate the rules. I think we've had a slightly more interesting level of debate this cycle, despite the problems with the moderation. But heading into 2028, conservatives really need to think seriously about, okay, how can we make sure that our views are represented in these debate meetings, and we have at least one debate featuring a fair host. I mean, we're talking a lot about why there isn't going to be another debate between Harris and former President Trump. And I think one of the real reasons is, yeah, Trump doesn't want to have another debate, but why should he? He debated
why should
with CNN
and we're out of time,
and
Matt,
he debated with ABC. There's time to have the Fox.
You don't
anchors,
walk
right?
into
And
another
she won't do
ambush.
it.
You don't do it.
Right, exactly.
Matt
We don't do
Continetti,
it.
thank you. I'll be listening to Commentary today. Thank you for doing the emergency podcast last night. You've saved my drive.
Thanks, you.
I want to remind everyone I will be out on the Battleground Tour, battlegroundtour.com, and I will be out there with my friends in Detroit, in Columbus, and especially in Pittsburgh at the Hyatt Regency Pittsburgh with Mike Gallagher and Larry Elder, along with Seth Holhouse and Representative Mike Kelly. John Steigerwald will be there. We're going to have a great time. For tickets, go to battlegroundtour.com. I want to go back to the debate, to the moment when J.D. Vance quite firmly took control of an out-of-control debate moderator set until they cut off his mic, and even then it didn't matter. Cut number 13.
Thank you, Governor. And just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status. temporary protected status.
Well,
Nora?
but
thank you,
Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important
we're
because
going to turn out of the
debate,
economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. We have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The
we
CBP
want to have
One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created.
Mike, you understand the most important substantive
because your mics are cut.
discussion about Springfield in the first debate comes up in the second debate. CBS breaks its pledge not to fact check. It fact checks J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance knows the facts. He corrects Margaret Brennan. He talks over Margaret Brennan's attempt to use body language and talking over him, and Nora O'Donnell's attempt to help Margaret Brennan move away from the fact that J.D. Vance is going to roll her out flat like a steamroller, and it doesn't stop him. And he finishes it. Tim Walz comes back in. J.D. begins to talk to him. They're having a debate. They're actually having a debate about immigration, about Springfield, but that is not what CBS wants. They've already realized that Tim Walz has lost this debate. They're both going to vote for Kamala Harris. They're both in the tank for Kamala Harris. They are both left-wingers. They are both hard left-wingers. You know it. I know it. America knows it. And they know that J.D. Vance was owning them, lock, stock, and barrel, jot and tittle, line by line, this line, this line, this line. He knows everything about Springfield, and they were not going to let him show the American people. They were not. And as a result, J.D. won the debate. He'd already won the debate with the first round, and he won the debate going away. Because you know what? The American people hate the multi-million-dollar media anchors who will not let J.D. Vance from Middleton, Ohio, author of Hillbilly Elegy, Marine and Yale Law School graduate, and a graduate of The Ohio State University, talk about what he knows and about which they know nothing because they've been briefed by left-wing interns who know nothing, and people have had it with the network. Bravo, J.D. I think you won the election last night because everyone in America knows they were trying to roll you, and you would not get rolled, and you would stand with our allies against our enemies. Amen. Joined by Ben Domenech, editor-at-large at The Spectator, Fox News contributor, and my go-to guy on the morning after debate. Thank goodness we don't have to do this too often, Ben, because my head's going to explode at the moderators. You get the first swing over the plate softball. What'd you think of last night?
Well, look, Hugh, I mean, I think you and I have both suffered through many terrible debates, many debates that were mismanaged, many debates that, are just not memorable for various reasons. This one is memorable. It's memorable both for one of, I think, the best performances that we have seen from a relative unknown on the debate stage in the modern era in J.D. Vance, and someone who is also relatively unknown being on the flip side of that, just a horrific performance by Tim Walz. And when I say that that's something that stands out, I think that it's particularly damning for Democrats for two reasons. One is I think that you and I both expected that J.D. Vance would have a good performance. What I don't think that we perhaps fully appreciated is how much he understood the task that was before him, which was to both critique Kamala Harris's agenda, the Biden administration, and everything that they've done, to make Tim Walz look bad on stage, which he didn't need a lot of help to do. And also, I think, to provide an alternate story to the one that the media narrative has been writing about him, one that connected with people, empathized with people, and put, I think, the best foot forward on the kind of policies that you would see from a second Trump administration. He managed to do all three of those things and do them extremely effectively. While Tim Walz, we all, kind of were looking at him and saying, this guy is not an experienced debater. We'll see what, he can do on stage. But there was an opportunity, I think, for him to also put kind of the best Midwestern spin on Kamala Harris's policies, to empathize with people, to connect, et cetera, et cetera. That was always, I thought, the way that he would try to approach this instead of being an attack dog. Instead, he turned into essentially an MSNBC commenter on stage, and not a particularly good one. You'd rank him as part of the D team, I think, if he was part of their election coverage. You wouldn't
kind of a
want him
crank
to
at the
sit
bar,
afterwards.
right? He's the guy you don't want to sit next to in a restaurant. He's too loud. He's moving his arms around, and he's calling himself a knucklehead.
I mean, I've compared him in the past to an MSNBC dad, from Shane Gillis's comedy, and that's really who he was talking to. If you think about what the media has described as his strongest moment, they are essentially, his performance on questions like abortion and the January 6th commentary. That's the stuff that the MSNBC commentariat cares the most about, and that's why they are automatically assuming that he was the one who connected on that. And I don't think he did a particularly good job on either of those, and those were probably his strongest moments. The moderators tried to bail him out frequently with softballs. They went after JD early on in a way that I found to be completely disruptive. There was a very productive, I thought, conversation happening between the two of them, one where they were disagreeing and they were making solid policy points on one of the central, if not the central question for this election, which is immigration. And they just cut it off. They cut it off because they wanted to move
JD refused, though. It was his best moment. He refused to be rolled by Margaret Brennan and Norah O'Donnell. He did it as a gentleman would, and he refused to be rolled. And I thought that was a good moment.
Nicole Wallace says it was mansplaining. See?
Well, again, they're talking to 0.1% of America, so I don't really care what Nicole Wallace says. Let me tell you about the Luntz Focus Group, which I just read about this morning. My practice is to turn off a debate and think about it after it's done so I'm not impacted by dummy comments. This one is Joe Concha relaying the Luntz Focus Group. There were 14 in the focus group before the debate, only 5 of whom were leaning Trump-Vance. Afterwards, by a margin of 12-2, those 14 people thought Vance won. Okay, that's pretty predictable. Does it have an impact on the election, Ben?
Well, here's the why I think it's going to have more of an impact than normal, and I think that you kind of have to assess it on relative terms. Vice presidential debates rarely have an impact. You could see and look back through, the different performances that people had. The media spin was that, for instance, that Paul Ryan lost his debate to Joe Biden. I don't happen to think he did, but it didn't. I don't think it changed the course of the campaign. But one of the things that I think you see in this one is that there is an outsized element here because of them having this stage for really the first time, being politicians who are unfamiliar to the large majority of the American audience, and particularly to independents. And I think that you look at that performance from Tim Walz as someone who is that very small sliver of Americans who are still making up their minds, and you don't get any more confidence about him than you had the previous day. And I think you have a lot more confidence in Vance. That's something that I think has to play a larger role than a typical VP performance. I don't know how much that matters, but on the margins in an election this close, Hugh, I think that it can't be discounted as something that could be looked back upon as a key moment when the Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaign had an opportunity to gain some momentum and instead took on water and look to me like they're going to have to be spinning and flailing through the next week.
How about, I kept posting this, Kamala Harris did not win one vote to get this nomination. She's made one decision in her campaign, which is to pick a running mate. He's a self-described knucklehead, and he didn't answer the question about China. Does that reflect on her ability to judge, evaluate, and select a staff?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because to me, that China question should have been easily anticipated. Minnesota Public Radio comes out, 36 hours, 48 hours earlier and reports this story, followed up on by the Free Beacon and that kind of thing. And so it's an obvious question that's going to be asked of him. It's just clear, this is going to be one you're going to have to deal with, Tim. You can't form an answer in 48 hours to explain why you lied for so long about being in China during Tiananmen. Well, I mean, it's by the way, these distinctions matter. I was in China covering the Hong Kong protests right before COVID and the shutdowns and everything that happened there with Senator Josh Hawley and with Ted Cruz there at the same time. I was covering that on the ground. I would never describe myself as being there, for instance, during the most violent stage of those protests. It's a distinction because that happened at different times, and yet he obviously fudged that in order to make for a more compelling story politically, which is the disturbing thing about his lies, by the way, Hugh. He always is lying in a way that's designed to make for this a more compelling story. It's not just big fish stories. It's something
he's a serial fabulist. Let me
Yeah.
ask you about this. Bill Bennett and I used to go out on the road together before Bill retired from radio. And in the early years of the War on Terror, he said, the good news is we are raising up a generation of young men and women who are warriors, and they will change America's politics. I think in Tom Cotton's appearances on the Sunday shows and J.D. Vance's last night, we're beginning to see that. Do you expect more of that, Ben, going forward?
I absolutely do, and I think that it's a very powerful and an impressive group of people who've gone through experiences that tested them and that put them through a lot. You know, I'm the same age, obviously. I'm a year and a half older than J.D. Vance, and it's one of these things where the experiences that you go through teach you a lot of things. It's one of the reasons that they have a different approach to politics, but also I think a different approach to the media. I think a previous generation of politicians might have been more deferential to those moderators in that moment, but because he's gone through the experience of seeing the way that they've covered Republican politicians for so many years, he had the deftness in that moment to respond effectively. And I think to point out something and to make clear, I'm actually making a substantive point here. It's true, it's right, and it's worth talking about. They tried to shut him down, and when they're doing that, you know that that's because he's making a point that is strong that they don't want him to make. It was sloppy, and I think it paid to his benefit. And just one more thing, Hugh. I look at this debate both through the context of what's going on right now in this moment, and also the sort of context of there are people who are distrustful of the age factor in this election, that, you know, Kamala Harris has been presenting herself as hopeful and joyful and, you know, Trump's of the past and he's going to be older, et cetera. Waltz tried to do a little bit of that, last night. I think that when you look at J.D. Vance, you can't help but have confidence that this is a guy who's ready to step into a significant role and be there on day one, prepared to do the job of vice president without any question. And that's just not
Now,
true.
Ben, I'm going to ask you to stay if you can. I don't know if you can because I only booked you for 1 second, but I want to talk to you about what wasn't discussed last night. Again, education learning loss, COVID shutdown, school choice. There is so much that wasn't discussed, and it's because our media is fundamentally captured by, I mean, who's running this, Ben? I know because I've been there, but who do you think is running this?
Well, I honestly, the problem is it's not just that it's bad questions. It's not just that they're leaving out things. It's that they are pressing their foot on the scale in so many obvious ways that even people who are not dedicated partisans see it. It's why the trust in media is so low. It's why there's no accountability. It's why they never want to look back at the mistakes that they made, that their networks made, that their newspapers made. They never question them until afterwards. They never question them until after the decisions have been made. And that's what's so corrupt about it.
I want to talk about with you China. In the last two debates, Xi Jinping has been treated as a Voldemort kind of character. He must not be named by the networks. And it's been pointed out to me that both ABC, I knew ABC is owned by Disney with parks, but I didn't realize that CBS has got a Paramount tie and they need the Chinese market as well. Is that the explanation? Is it just money?
I think that it's actually a more significant part of this whole conversation than people necessarily recognize, Hugh. And I'm glad that you raise it because it's something that's been of concern to me for quite some time. The temptation of the Chinese market, and the need to be able to manage expectations related to it is a real driver for these major corporate media entities. And it's something that they obviously have in the back of their head when it comes to asking some of these questions. And it is something where I believe that there is pressure put upon them from the top down that says, we should be careful when we're talking about this. We don't want to offend them. Just think about how the Chinese responded to very basic insults that they detected in our media. Think about how they responded to the jacket and Top Gun and things like that.
The NBA, the NBA general manager of the Houston club.
Yes, the Houston Rockets, and the way that they reacted to all sorts of different things that made ESPN do things like change their geography of the South China Sea and stuff like that. It's completely a factor, and we should appreciate it as for one of the major reasons why We cannot continue to have this kind of moderation in presidential debates going forward. I know you and I have talked about this in the past, but it cannot be a factor in the questions that get asked. And this is obviously a huge issue in terms of something that's going to be confronted within the next 4 years by this administration. Major questions. Just asking Tim Walz, saying, you've been to China all the time. You say you learned a lot from it. What do you think about our policies related to Taiwan? What should we be doing when you have ships getting rammed? What you should be doing right now to prepare to prevent, a broader conflict, a broader war, in the South China Sea? And how can we bolster our allies in the region? That's a good question to ask to somebody who's talked about how he's been to China so many times and has formed his opinions related to that. That's something.
What about Jimmy Lai? What about the Uyghurs? I mean, there are so many questions that don't get asked. Let me ask you this, Ben, before we go back on here, because it's a quiz. Do you know where the vice presidential nominees in 1940 were? Franklin Roosevelt against Wendell Willkie, but they're not. Their vice presidents were Henry Wallace and Charles McNary. Now, can you imagine in 1940 a debate between those two individuals, not mentioning Germany's invasion of Poland or Japan's invasion of China? That's what was last night.
I was going to say I remembered Wallace, but I was not remembering. Sorry, I would have failed the second question of the quiz. But here's the deal. It's so pressing, it's so obvious, and you could ask the question from so many different angles, and they didn't spend any time on it. They spent more time on climate. By the way, a softball for Tim Walz that I think he did a terrible job of. I don't know if you saw.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
The reactions from some of the people who were responding to this online from some of the other opinion groups, but the fact is that they actually gave that answer to J.D. Vance in a number of the different assessments. Which, if you can't answer a question about climate, I think you're worse than replacement level Democrat. You're worse than generic Democrat.
That's a little baseball analytics sneaking in there. Ben Domenech, my sixth grandchild was born yesterday. I'm very blessed, and we will help.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We will help parents send children to Catholic schools or private schools because I think much of American public education is falling apart, accelerated by COVID. If Mary Catherine Ham had been on that stage last night, she would have asked for responsibility about education loss. My guess is, I don't know, that Nora O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, if they have children, they do not attend public schools in the neighborhoods in which they live. I could be wrong. I don't know. Why is that never discussed? If they're going to do childcare, why don't they talk about our public education system?
Well, again, this is one of those situations where they want to memory hole the entire issue. They want to pretend like the decisions that were made were automatic at the time instead of what they were, which was in the case of Tim Walz, the decisions that were being made in Minnesota were some of the most aggressive in the nation in terms of keeping things closed. It is wholly owned by the teachers' unions and preventing the kind of learning that these children needed and that the rest of the world knew that they could get without high risk of any kind of COVID reactions or anything along those lines among young children. The rest of the world opened up and we didn't. Why is that something that won't happen again, Tim Walz? That's a very basic question. And then when it comes to the issue of course, choice in education, the interest in that among parents has exploded in the wake of COVID. And it's something that is an obvious question going forward in terms of what, the Harris-Walz administration would do on that front. And yet they didn't ask that question. So, look, they left so many things on the table, Hugh. But
you know what? They did. There's a great graphic out there of J.D. Vance in a Looney Tunes setting where he's giving you that side eye. And I don't know if we can put that up for people watching on this. There it is. That's all, folks. And it kind of sums it up. But when they went J6 at the end, they did not go to the burning of Minneapolis. I thought that was maybe the most ham-handed attempt to dredge Tim Walz from the bottom of the pool. What did you think about that?
I completely agree in terms of in part because of where they positioned the question. Positioning it at the end and then making it a question that is always framed, by the way, around threat to democracy, which I think is something that the media talks about, but is actually not the thing that people care about. Instead, I think people care about these things in the context of law and order. They think about it in those contexts more than anything else. And that's where I think, you could have gotten a much better answer from both participants on stage, both about, you could have asked J.D. Vance about January 6th and about perhaps, Donald Trump's promise to pardon people who have been convicted since then. And then you could ask, Tim Walz about what happened in Minneapolis and what he would have done differently, because he said publicly that he made mistakes, that he didn't approach it the right way. And so that's something that's an obvious question that's more balanced, but they didn't ask it that way. They did it, again, in a kind of softball way to try to throw it down the center for Tim Walz. And look, they can seize on that as much as they want. Voters tell us, and they tell us consistently in polls, Hugh, that this is a very low-ranking issue for them. They've made up their minds about it one way or the other. And when it comes to actually the issues that people care about, immigration, the economy, crime, and the kind of situation, the chaos that they see around the world, there were not enough questions asked about that. And, Hugh, you and I were both wrong when it came to our predictions, I have to say. You predicted that they were going to use that Zelensky comment against him, which I was frankly shocked that they did not, because I thought you were right. And then I thought that Tim Walz would end up getting angry, that he might, sort of lean into that thing that we've seen him do a couple times in the past in exchanges with voters. Instead, it was almost worse than that. I think if he had gotten more passionate on something, he perhaps would have had a better debate. But he seemed woefully unprepared.
They did not screen test Tim Walz. They really did not screen test. He's terrible on television. Just absolutely
terrible. Yes. And JD, to his credit, because JD is, and you and I both, know and have met him. He is a policy wonk. He is a nerd. Okay, he really is, and that's who he is deep down. Not all policy wonks can perform the way that he did last night, which was smooth, empathetic, prepared, knowledgeable without seeming like he's talking down to the audience, not being a smart aleck, not letting the obvious media tilt get under his skin. And I thought answering every question that they threw at him very capably. I don't agree with him on every single issue, but I thought that performance was really one for the books. It's something that's memorable.
And you know what? Restraint is an undervalued ability. Is. And he was restrained and calm and a grown-up and reassuring. Ben Domenech, thank you for the extra time this morning. Follow Ben on X at @BDomenech. Read him at The Spectator, where he's editor-at-large. And, of course, see him on Fox News, where he's a contributor. Thank you, Ben. Congressman Michael Waltz is a Green Beret who has served in combat. He's also a member of the Senate and of the House Intelligence Committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee, House Oversight Committee. Congressman, for years, Bill Bennett and I would go out on the road, and we would talk about the good things ahead for America. And he always said, our veterans will come back from these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They will take over American politics, and we'll have a renaissance. I think we saw a little bit of that last night with J.D. Vance. We've seen it with you on television. We've seen it with Tom Cotton on television. Do you think the country is aware that our veterans are actually changing American politics?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up, Hugh. It's been a passion of mine to increase the number of veterans that are engaged in political office, and that doesn't necessarily just mean Congress. I mean, city council, mayors, state reps. And it's not that we agree on every issue, but it is the perspective that we bring. And it's the ethos, it's the leadership, discipline, followership, teamwork. And if we were all willing to die for that flag, we can roll up our sleeves and take the arrows and take the tough votes. We were at a record low in 2018 when I ran for Congress. We've declined from 75% of the Congress were vets in the 70s down to 15%. And I got to tell you, Hugh, after Afghanistan, veterans started coming out of the woodwork after that debacle, disgrace of a withdrawal. We've increased that percentage now. We're headed back to 25%. It's not nearly enough, but it's the first increase in decades.
Well, it is widely agreed that Senator Vance mopped the floor with Governor Walz last night. I think part of it is he's unflappable, he's calm, and that might come from being yelled at by a drill sergeant at Parris Island, and it might come from Yale Law School, but it probably comes from running around Iraq, even though he's not in combat, he's in a combat zone. And you can't really lose your cool, can you?
No, you can't. And I gotta be honest with you. The first 30 seconds, you could tell people want to see someone who is prepared. Especially, I mean, President Trump has a motor like like nobody I've ever seen. But the vice president's got to be ready to go. He's got to instill confidence. That did not happen with Walls. He literally looked like a deer in the headlights. And then number two, a messenger for your principal. I thought Vance crushed it. I will say on that first question, on the Middle East and on Israel, I was just screaming, and I would just say for every Trump surrogate out there, I was screaming Abraham Accords, Abraham Accords, Abraham Accords, because I think we've got to remind Americans it was just a few years ago that President Trump was literally signing peace deals that nobody thought was possible, that any other president would have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize on the White House lawn. And look where we were yesterday with 200 ballistic missiles flying across the Middle East, and our service members getting stuck in the middle of it once again. But I thought he did a fantastic job. I thought his best answer of the night, Hugh, I don't know if you've already discussed this with some of your guests, was his comment on the experts. And he did it in such a way that I think just completely neutered all of these ridiculous economists and PhDs and what have you that the mainstream media keeps trying to roll out, and that the experts were wrong on outsourcing everything to China. The experts were wrong on shutting down our schools under COVID, and just boom, 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 went right down the list and said, this is why you need a disruptor and an outsider in Donald Trump in Washington, D.C.
Congressman, my favorite response is when Margaret Brennan, a leftist, I used to think she was just a liberal, now I think she's a leftist, tried to shut him down after fact-checking him, which they said they weren't going to do, and he refused. He was respectful, he acted in a gentlemanly fashion, but he simply refused to be rolled. And I think that's the kind of thing the American people want, because we hate the media. I mean, just generally, we hate the media. Let me talk to you about Iran, because the big story yesterday, I thought they were going to spend the whole debate on this. Iran has used ballistic missiles 3 times in 5 years. Once at Americans at al-Assad, twice at Israelis in the last year. 300 missiles total against Israel now. What are we going to do about this regime? Tim Walz had no idea, and J.D. Vance had a clue, but what do you think we should do?
Look, the outlines of a strategy are pretty clear, but you have to make the focus of your Middle East policy Iran and not pressuring Israel and getting to a ceasefire. As much as we all want our hostages out, that only essentially kicks the can for all of this to happen all over again. So number one, to get our hostages out, you put Iran on a clock. For every week that goes by and Americans are sitting in tunnels under Gaza, we turn it up a notch. You turn up another sanction, another consequence, another cyber attack, shut down their oil exports. I mean, we could put a whole menu of consequences out there, and every week that goes by, Iran, until you tell Hamas to release our hostages, we put another consequence on the table. That's one. Number two, secondary sanctions on Chinese buyers of Iranian oil. 90% of Iran's illegal oil is going to China. President Trump told China, you keep buying from them, you can't buy from us. The House has passed secondary sanctions. Schumer's been sitting on it. Number three, you put the UN sanctions and actually enforce them back on the table on their missile program that Biden and Harris allowed to lapse. And then number four, and I think this is the biggest thing, most important, is you support the dissidents inside Iran. Twice now, under Obama and under Biden, you've had massive uprisings within Iran. The latest one was Mahsa Amini, the Kurdish girl that was murdered for not wearing a hijab. Massive nationwide protests, and Biden sat on his hands just like Obama did in 2009. The thing the regime fears the most is its own people, and if it's looking inward, it's not causing chaos outward. I could keep going down the list, Hugh, but we know what to do with Iran, and it was working under Trump's maximum pressure.
Now I want to turn to China, because we've had 3 hours of debate now between ABC and CBS, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, J.D. Vance, and Tim Walz. China has never come up. The word Xi Jinping, the name Xi Jinping has not been uttered. It's like Voldemort. We must not name him. I think we have to go forward and just say, if you're a media company with ties to China, we're not going to let you run a debate. It's an embarrassment. It's like not talking about Japan in a 1940 presidential debate or not talking about Germany in the same thing. Ukraine didn't come up last night. What is wrong with these networks in China? Are they compromised by their interests in doing business there?
No Ukraine, no school choice, no China. And instead, we get climate and abortion, which seem to go on. I haven't seen a clock on it. Incredibly long, an
3
incredibly long
rounds.
time. They just let it keep going. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the moderators definitely show their bias in their hands, Hugh. I said last time I would advise President Trump not to go back on unless it was you. And I mean that. Um, but look, I agree with you, and it is everybody is drunk on Chinese money across every institution in America: the media, the entertainment industry, the sports industry, Wall Street, you name it. And I thought the biggest flub of the night was Walls and his Tiananmen Square. I mean, how do you say that you're a coach that cares about kids? He's very proud that he stood up for a gay child. Good on him. But how do you continue to go year after year after year and turn a blind eye to a regime that is brutally oppressing its people, that massacred students in the streets in Tiananmen Square? And I think, we could really call him out. I don't think this China story in Walls has gotten enough attention.
Yeah,
But
knucklehead
at the end of the
apparently
day,
stands for
how do
liar.
you win this competition? How do you end the Cold War? Is a question that should be asked.
Yeah, but I'm a knucklehead. That's Minnesotan for I lie a lot about what I've done. Congressman Michael Waltz, thank you for joining me. I appreciate your joining me. Real quick, you have a 2-year-old. You have child care issues. I just they had 2 questions on child care. It just isn't an issue for the federal government, is it?
Yeah. Look, I think it's we could look at tax incentives, we could look at help for sure. But I'll point out that President Trump actually approved, signed into law, paternal and maternal leave for the federal government and the military on his watch. So he took a huge step.
Oh, good point. David Drucker is with the Dispatch. David, you watched last night. Kamala Harris had one choice to make in this campaign. One, pick a vice president candidate. We saw Tim Walz last night. How'd he do?
Well, he didn't have a very good night. So if you're grading him on debate points, on debate style, on command of the issues and the ability to argue points in a debate, he did not do well. And look, these things don't tend to matter all that much, but in a race of inches, every little bit helps, and sometimes things can hurt that don't normally hurt. So we'll see how it goes. I don't think that Walz disqualified himself, and that's the one thing you look for in a vice presidential debate. That's all that matters. You and I've talked about that. But Vance, I think, did a lot to, and this is important, I think, for the Trump campaign, did a lot to reverse what people think of him, his image, what kind of person he is. That could be very helpful to former President Trump.
I've been telling people on text all day. He did the Ohio State University proud last night, Yale Law School and the Marines as well, but he was unflappable, absolutely unflappable. And the key moment for me is that CBS was in the tank again. It was 3-on-1 again. And when Margaret Brennan attempted to cut him off after a fact check that was not supposed to happen, he wasn't having it, David. I think that was a very impressive moment, and the Frank Luntz focus group came out 12-2 in his favor. It started out 4-8 against him. What'd you make of the moderators in that moment?
Well, that was just let me say that I don't know if it was a mistake. I don't know if it was on purpose. It shouldn't have been done. It broke their own rules. And, in an interview, I find that perfectly acceptable. I do it in interviews.
Sure.
I did it in interviews last night in the spin room. In a debate, especially if you haven't laid it out as a part of the way the debate's going to work, you just don't do that. Margaret Brennan's a professional. I was really surprised at that. I will say that I found elements of the questions surprising, but other than that moment, I didn't find it to be a particularly troublesome debate, and I didn't
No, here's the
attack
most
some of the
troubling thing,
issues of the
David. I
last
really
debate.
want you to think about this. You guys at the Dispatch are serious. Sit down with Hayes and Jonah. ABC and CBS did 3 hours of debate. They did not ask one question about China. It's as though Xi Jinping is Voldemort. I believe they are compromised. Not that they're being run by China, but they're afraid of losing money and getting banned and being thrown out. Disney, of course, owns ABC. It is the most glaring thing in the world. Our superpower competitor enemy is China, and it did not come up in 6 hours of debates by our two major networks, both of which have interest in China. Is that a problem?
Well, look, I think it's a problem if you don't ask about the key issues, right? And I have this memory of China being raised during the presidential debate itself. It clearly wasn't
Tariffs were
raised
brought
last
up,
night.
but not China. Tariffs on our part, but not China. Not its ambition.
Well, and listen, that's something that I'm interested in watching, and I think it should be asked. What surprised me last night was that, and I'm just saying surprised, that usually in these vice presidential debates, you get what would you do if you were all of a sudden the commander in chief question, right? There's usually some question about, in the unfortunate event that you end up in the top job, what do you do then in some fashion? And that wasn't raised. And so I will say, though, if you looked at the reaction from viewers, they felt like it was a substantive issues-based debate, and they liked the fact that the two candidates weren't screaming at each other or yelling at each other
Oh,
or
yes.
angry at each other.
That was fine. The candidates did great. The moderators did bad. David, we had 180 missiles fired at Israel yesterday. They spent 10 minutes on World War III's edge because I can't believe it. 10 minutes. What did you think it was going to go longer?
Well, I thought the foreign policy component, especially because Margaret Brennan was one of the moderators, would be more robust and substantial. I really did. And so that surprised me. But I do know as a journalist, you're trying to get to a number of different things in a format like this, and it can be very difficult. I've been on the receiving end of criticism. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you follow up here? Why don't you ask this question or that question? So if it sounds like I'm pulling my punches here, I am, because I just know how difficult this is. But as a viewer, and as somebody who's interested in how this impacts the campaign, more foreign policy would be good. But Hugh, every 4 years we have this complaint. I don't know if you and I together. But I have it every 4 years.
David, I've done 5 of these debates. I've done 5 of them. If you stand your ground in the debate prep, you get to ask about the nuclear triad. You get to ask about TikTok. You just have to stand your ground when the interns and the associate producers all want to talk about abortion for the 10th time. I'm just amazed that we're talking about abortion and childcare.
Well, listen, abortion, you're going to have to talk about. Childcare, I could have done without.
I mean, what did we learn about abortion?
It doesn't matter.
Everybody knows Trump says.
Abortion is the reason the reason you talk about abortion rights is the reason you talk about immigration and inflation, and the reason you should talk about foreign policy, because it's something voters really care about. And so all of these other extraneous issues around the edges, you let go, but those belonged in there.
On the morning after a very significant day in world history, Iran fired 180 ballistic missiles at the Jewish state. None of them hit. Israel is going to hit back hard. The United States should assist them. It also comes the day after a debate between vice presidential candidates, which J.D. Vance won handily. I think Donald Trump is going back to the White House, and J.D. is going to be a fine vice president. And it came on the day that I became a grandfather for the 6th time. I got very little sleep last night because I'm worried about freedom. I'm worried about what my new grandbaby, is going to grow up with, because the irresponsibility of the American media and the irresponsibility of the Democratic Party and the malign intent of Iran and China and Russia worries me about this world. Now, my friend John Schroeder writes frequently over at HughHewitt.com. And he wrote a piece this morning called Overwhelming the News, which I would recommend to you that you go. Now, you can always watch the show over at HughHewitt.com. You can always listen to the show at HughHewitt.com. If you find yourself somewhere where you can't find the show on the radio dial, you haven't got your Salem News Channel app working, or you've got bad internet, you can always go to hughhewitt.com and watch the show or listen to the show. And John will usually write often there. He's a very smart guy. I hate to say that. But he's written this piece called Overwhelming the News. And it begins, Iran bombed via ballistic missiles Israel yesterday. It puts the world on the brink of war that could go nuclear. Tim Walz found a unique euphemism for I'm a liar in last night's Veep debate, as he described himself as a knucklehead. All reports are Vance dominated and CBS soiled themselves. This is huge, even massive news, but it is greatly overshadowed in my part of the world. John lives in Tennessee. These stories have pushed the devastation in the wake of Hurricane Helene out of the headlines, but it shouldn't. The damage is too real to me. The river that overwhelmed Nashville, North Carolina, is the French Broad River. It starts near Asheville and flows westward. It's fed by the Little Pigeon and the Nolichucky rivers, and then just about 5 miles from my home, a little bit more than 100 miles from Asheville, it joins the Holstein River to become the Tennessee River. Less than a mile down the road from me, the river flows directly at the roadside for roughly a quarter of the mile. The road, a road that dates back to the Revolutionary War times, above the river, cut out of a marble bluff. You look out of the bluff and you can plainly see the floodplain. The floodplain now thoroughly and completely inundated. Some houses on the plain underwater, others with the river lapping at their back doors, their boathouses underwater. What I witness there every day, just to go anywhere, is a controlled flood, given that there are dams upstream releasing the water at a pace millions of times more than normal, yet not so much as to threaten any but the foolish few who insisted on building on the plain. Parens, after all, it was not flooded like this in the near forever, as a lifelong resident told me the other day. 2 miles from my home, in the opposite direction, is I-40, where signs now and for likely a year to come flash brightly in the eastbound lanes telling them to go there, that the highway is completely washed out just 35 miles ahead. I am forever grateful to God Almighty that my wife and I escaped the genuine devastation of this storm. But that devastation remains unavoidable to us. The signs are all around us. The anecdotes are heartbreaking. The host, that would be me, pointed out yesterday that Hurricane Katrina dominated the news for weeks, but it hit a major metropolitan area. There was a racial slant that could be given to the coverage. Yet here is what people ignore. This area, equally damaged and devastated, is an economically vital region, home to a strategic source of high-purity quartz used in semiconductors, a source that must be dried up for months to come. Remember the chip shortages that crippled the automotive industry during the pandemic? That may dwarf that problem. Then there is this. The gorgeous fall colors still come this month to the Great Smoky Mountains in western New York, but many of the millions of travelers who normally arrive at this time of the year, most visited national park, probably will not in the wake of Hurricane Helene. The result is a triple tragedy for the region. Extensive damage that has closed many roads and trails in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, thousands of homes and businesses in ruins, and millions of dollars in lost revenues from tourism and recreation. The full extent of the damages to the park and the community surrounding it may not be known for weeks, but it is clearly a calamitous situation in a park that draws 13.3 million visitors, 3 times more than either the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone National Park, according to the National Park Service. Tourism is simply the economy in the areas hardest hit by this storm. And this is the time when it is at its highest, tourism. The conditions of the roads are such that people cannot get here, even if they wanted to. The economy of the region will be distressed for a very long time to come, as well as people's vacations. The need around here is immense. The most immediate need is drinking water. Distribution points are being set up in the area, even as movement remains highly problematic. Did you know you can buy bottled water by the pallet or truckload on Amazon? You and a couple of neighbors could easily put together enough to buy a pallet, and your church could quickly raise enough to buy a truckload. Please consider doing so. There's a distribution point in the heart of the damage. Cook County Water Distribution Point, 613 West Broadway Street, Newport, Tennessee. But access in Coke County is difficult. Here in neighboring Knox County, we're also collecting. Knox County Engineering and Public Works Department, 205 West Baker Avenue, Knoxville, Tennessee. You ponder donations to Team Rubicon and Red Cross for the devastation. Please also consider this very immediate and impactful donation avenue. The war in Israel will continue for weeks or more. The election is still a month away. This pain is now. This need is now. Please respond now. I was happy to read that. Very pleased. Schroeder's, I give him a hard time. He's a very brilliant writer and a very good man. And he and his wife left California and moved to Tennessee, and he's adopted his hometown is now in Knoxville and in Tennessee. But I do think last night's debate, I know how these things are put together and they're rehearsed. The hardest thing for a debate team to do is to deal with new news. And the new news yesterday was a ballistic missile attack on Israel and the devastation of 4 states, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia. North Carolina, hardest hit, but all 4 of them suffering great damage. I am marveling, but not in amazement, in despair, at the inability of an ideologically driven news organization to detach from their pre-existing decisions to try and get J.D. Vance on abortion, to try and save Tim Walz on his lives, and to try and elect Kamala Harris. That was the agenda yesterday. The other agenda was, whatever you do, don't bring up China. We do too much business there. It is now clear to me that not only did they ignore American suffering, as elites do, the people, don't just blame Margaret and Nora, the people who ran that debate, the headquarters at CBS, the Tiffany Network, Paramount Studios, they all live lives detached from the reality of ordinary Americans. They all live lives of chauffeured cars and eating out. They all live lives of private schools. And it's fine. I'm for people progressing. I'm a 1%er. I'm 68 years old. I've had 4 jobs every day of my entire life. I've had 4 jobs because I believe in work. Because my parents believed in work. They were depression kids. I think America's great because people can end up coming from nowhere and ending up somewhere. I got nothing against success. But you can't forget the country. You really can't be driven by your ideological desire for Kamala Harris to be the president. You can't not bring up China. The equivalent to last night's debate would be a debate between the running mates of FDR and Wendell Willkie. FDR ran with Henry Wallace in 1940, and Wendell Willkie ran with the Senate minority leader from Oregon, McFarland, I think, or McLean, a senator. If they had been debating in 1940 and they hadn't talked about Germany's invasion of Poland or swallowing of Czechoslovakia because it would have been too early in the calendar. No, the invasion of Poland was 1939. Germany was at war with France and in Europe. And Japan had invaded China years earlier. Can you imagine in 1940 not talking about that? They didn't have a vice presidential debate then. We did now. And we failed because the idiocracy is running the media, and the idiocracy is also run by people who are worried about China's dollars, their business. It's time to disqualify the networks from covering the news, at least the news about Iran and China and Russia, because they have a conflict of interest. And American politicians rightfully operate under conflict of interest rules, as do I at the Washington Post, at Salem, at Fox News. I've always got to declare my conflicts, and that's a good thing, and stay away from things that I have a conflict. But the biggest conflict of interest of all are the American networks that are compromised by China. And you need to know it, and we need to spell it out, and we have to say, fail, CBS, fail, ABC, you're out of the game. I do not know Scott Jennings. I've never met him. He worked in W's White House. He worked for Leader McConnell. I think W is the best man who's been president in my lifetime. I think Mitch McConnell is the greatest leader of the Republicans in either house in my lifetime. So he has worked for the best in many respects. Best man, best tactician. He's also now the only conservative on CNN. Scott Jennings last night walked into the post-debate after everyone had seen Tim Walz's meltdown in real time, and they had this discussion about abortion.
Give him credit for solicitude. Look, the policies, maybe not.
I just had this thing in Minnesota. There were 8 deaths among infants who survived abortion attempts during Tim Walz's tenure as governor. It happened. They don't want to talk about the fact that it happened, but there were children.
What's the source?
First of all, let me ask you a question. Since you've deeply researched this, what were the condition of these?
Yes.
Of these
Look,
babies when they were born?
Why can't
what was the participation of the family?
They tried to abort the babies, and they survived the abortion, and then they died.
And you think that families casually tossed them aside?
No, I think.
Tell me what their condition was, Scott. Could they have survived? And was it a case of families not wanting children to suffer when they were told that they are doomed?
Yes. Yeah.
Is that
the reality of the case.
That seems important to me.
Here's what I will say. Keep talking about that, because when you all talk about abortion like this.
For a moment, Scott Jennings has the goods. He brought the receipts. 8 cases of post-abortion survival where the law that Tim Walz signed applied. David Axelrod is a pro and a very smart man. He does not want that out. The other person, I don't know the third person who broke in, but you see, it was 4 against 1. It was just like the debate, 3 against 1. And if you're going to bring up abortion, let's talk about late-term abortion. In one of the many debate prep sessions that I did, in the 5 debates that I have co-moderated with big media, the question of late-term abortions came up. And one of my interlocutors said, that's very rare. I said, well, what are the numbers? Well, I don't know. Of course you don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows and nobody wants to know. They don't want to talk about it. All I'm saying is that big media is irreversibly broken except at Fox. Except at Bret Baier's special report, there is not one primetime news show that is remotely close to the center of American politics, to the center of American public policy. There is no one covering North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina and Virginia the way that every network covered Katrina, because the resources of the networks, which are run by leftists, are devoted to the stories that hurt Republicans because they're friends who are going to give them jobs in future administrations and increase their ratings and be their bookings. It is such a corrupt system. It's not state-run. It's not Pravda, but it is just so fundamentally corrupt. Now, here's the bottom line. If CNN had a brain, if they cared about their shareholders, whoever owns CNN now, and I don't know, they'd give Scott Jennings a show at the 8 o'clock hour, the 9 o'clock hour, and they said, Scott, have people on. You're good at this. You're funny. You're smart. You actually have real-world experience, which puts you apart from almost everybody else in the news business. This is why I've made my bones as I worked in the White House. I was at DOJ. I teach con law, I practice law, I have a family, I've lived in different places. I actually know what I'm talking about. Scott Jennings has worked for Mitch McConnell and Debbia. He knows what he's talking about. Most of these talking heads don't. And that's why media is broken. Badly, badly broken. Michael Whatley is chairman of the Republican National Committee. He joins me now. Well, congratulations, Michael. The GOP dominated that debate last night. J.D. Vance, a son of Ohio, where I'm from. We should just make all people from Ohio in charge of things. What'd you think?
A great win. I think it was a great win for J.D. Vance in the arena. I think he had an absolutely fantastic debate. But it was also a great win for Donald Trump because Kamala Harris needed a knockout punch last night to try and change the equation in this election, and she did not get it. She did not get a win. She really didn't advance anything. Tim Walz did not land any punches on Donald Trump effectively at all over the course of the night. In fact, I think the big winner, J.D. Vance, really, truly went after Kamala Harris and her positions by talking directly to the American voters about the issues that they care about. And that is really what has resonated throughout all of the conversation following the debate.
You know, Chairman Whatley, there are a few things that stick out after a debate. One is this Looney Tunes ripoff, which I want to put up on the screen for you to watch and the people watching on the Salem News Channel. Some wag out there figured out that if we could find a picture of J.D. Vance and do that's all, folks, that look says it all. J.D. just owned him. And I don't know who you were watching it with. I was watching it by myself. He just owned him on everything.
He really did. Look, and I think the key is, I had one reporter ask me yesterday, is he going to go after Walz or is he going to go after Kamala Harris? And my response was, he's going to talk directly to the American voters. That's exactly what he did. He really brought up and talked about over and over and over again the three key issues that really right now every American voter cares about, which are the economy, inflation, gasoline prices, grocery prices, housing prices. Number two, our southern border and illegal immigration, the fact that we've got 10, 12, 15 million illegal immigrants who have come across the border while Kamala Harris has been the border czar. They're bringing migrant crime. They're bringing fentanyl. They're bringing higher housing prices and higher prices across the board with them. And then third, look at what's happening in Israel right now. The fact that we have missiles that are coming from Iran and its proxies into Israel. We're on the verge of a big, broad regional war right now, closer than we've been in a long time. Iran is closer to having nuclear weapons than they've ever had before. All of that is happening under Kamala Harris's watch, and she is not in a position, if she were to win this thing, to be able to really try and put that genie back in the box. And we really do need peace through strength, which is only going to come with Donald Trump in the White House.
Now, Chairman Watley, I would add one other topic, which is the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. I have a piece over at HughHewitt.com written by my contributor, John Schroeder, talking about Tennessee. It came up briefly, but of course, I always think in terms of Katrina coverage. These people are suffering, and CBS is not nimble enough to figure out how to put that question to the two candidates for vice president about FEMA's failure, about the failure of NOAA to predict the rainfall, about the failure to move people out of harm's way. It's a massive federal bureaucracy failure. And I don't know that CBS understands that or if they don't want to cover it, but what do you think about that?
Well, I could just say, my family has been affected. I live in North Carolina. My family lives up in the mountains. And thankfully, everybody is okay on my side. But look, we will have plenty of time to look at the political implications of this storm. The first thing is we just need to pray and work that the recovery, the rescue operations are going to be successful. And we need to get supplies on the ground up there. We need cell coverage. We need, water. We need food. We need electricity.
Oh, we just lost the feed, Rat. I want to go back
catastrophic loss,
okay, you're
both
back.
in terms of lives and upheaval. So that's key number one, right? Key number two is when we sit down.
Oh, whatever's happening here is that your feed is coming in and out on us, Chairman. You're back. Go ahead. Key number two. Well, we've lost the chairman. I think that's probably because he's probably in a hotel in New York where everyone's turning on the inner tubes at the same time, and he's lost his bandwidth, which is fine. I'm glad to have the chairman. He's back? Good. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. I've sent people to the Salvation Army and Operation Team Rubicon, and there are lots of other groups. They need a lot of help. I do think we have some major political failures on our hands, though.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree, and I think the fact that President Trump was on the ground in Georgia the other day sends a very big signal. The fact that he's going to be back in North Carolina, over soon, and we'll wait and see kind of what that's going to look like for it. But what we need right now is just to make sure that people are going to be okay. We will have those conversations soon enough.
All right, now I want to turn to the biggest question of all. We've had 3 hours of debate. Hour and a half on ABC and a half on CBS. The name Xi Jinping was not mentioned. He's like Voldemort. He must not be mentioned. These networks have conflicts of interest with China. And I do not know that they were ordered not to bring up China. I brought up China in all three of my questions at the GOP presidential debate in Miami this year. What is up with these networks? They're not talking about our number one adversary in the world. Why?
No, they're not. And they're also not talking about the economy. It's clearly that they do not want to talk about the topics that are going to help Donald Trump. Right now, the issues that really, truly matter are our southern border, our economy, and what is happening on the world stage, and whether or not America is going to be strong enough to be able to defend our interests at home and abroad. And if you're going to dodge those types of questions, this is what you're going to see from those moderators.
So, Chairman Watley, Reince Priebus introduced conservatives onto the debate stage. Ronna McDaniel assured that continued and was very adamant about doing so and killed off the Presidential Debate Commission. Your job and your successor's job is to somehow figure out how to fix this. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because we can't have left-wing moderator after left-wing moderator after left-wing moderator, and we've had 4 in a row now.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to see what happened with Donald Trump saying he's not going to do any more debates unless and until they're going to be on a network that is going to play it absolutely straight. I think, CNN had the opportunity to step up and play it straight. They did it. Clearly, ABC did not, and CBS, they had a hard time with it last night. I think the fact that J.D. Vance was able to fact check them in the middle of a fact check was really a brushback pitch. And after that, they played it more straight. But the questions definitely were skewed to try and help Tim Walz, to try and help Kamala Harris. Fortunately, J.D. Vance was that good, and he still won the debate, even if it was 3 versus 1.
Last question. I believe that J.D. Vance helped win the election because people who watched in Pennsylvania heard them talking about energy. And they know that Kamala Harris is going to shut down domestic energy. J.D. brought up nuclear, which is finally someone brought up nuclear other than Doug Burgum. I'm very happy about that. Do you think J.D. Vance helped win the election last night?
I think he did. Kamala Harris needed a knockout punch last night from Tim Walz. She didn't get it. J.D. Vance clearly articulated the president's vision, President Trump's vision for America going forward, which is strength versus weakness. We want to be a strong country. Everybody from all 50 states wants America to be strong. They want a strong southern border. They want a strong economy, and they want us to have a strength to be able to defend ourselves and our allies at home and abroad. That is going to happen with President Trump in office. That was the message that J.D. Vance delivered last night. I think the 2 winners were J.D. Vance on the stage and Donald Trump overall.
Well said, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you. I've been saying that all morning, and it's not partisan happy talk. It's what is registered overall, everywhere, except maybe MSNBC, and they're probably just deep in despair. Thank you, Chairman Michael Watley, RNC Chairman. I want to go to my favorite cut from last night, which is when JD pushes back at Margaret when she attempts to throw him off. Cut number 12.
The governor has made the point, and I think as a sitting lawmaker, you know that Congress controls the purse strings and any funding. So you have said repeatedly that Donald Trump would, through executive action...
Sorry, it's cut number 13. That was very loaded too, but cut number 13.
Thank you, Governor. And just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret.
Do you understand she's getting rolled, so she has to interrupt him? I love that. I think it was elegantly done. She wouldn't put up with it. Jim Garrity is my colleague at the Washington Post. He's also at the National Review. I do not know what you wrote about. I turned off the TV, and I haven't listened to the editor's podcast yet. Jim, your assessment of last night's debate.
So, Hugh, why does Tim Walz always have an easy time knowing what time it is?
Why?
Because J.D. Vance just cleaned his clock.
Okay.
not a smudge on
I
it.
should have.
That's
a dad joke. I should have known that.
Yeah. No, look, JD, when you're the vice presidential nominee in a challenger, you only really get 2 big moments to shine in the normal campaign. One is the convention speech, and the other is the vice presidential debate. And JD Vance I got disagreements with the guy, but he aced both of them. He went out. He was as smooth and polished as your mom's fine china. He memorized the briefing books. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. I loved his kind of skeptical, The Office, looking at the camera, fourth wall. Could you believe this guy? Kind of.
Oh, throw up the Looney Tunes picture for Jim. Throw up the Looney Tunes picture. You've seen that. I just love that.
Yeah. Meanwhile, in a moment that called for, clearly, I think a lot of Democrats wanted toughness. They wanted, Tim Walz to just tear into the Trump ticket and Republicans. He looked like he was made of Nerf. To use a line from that Saturday Night Live sketch, he looked like Charlie Brown as an adult. He the moment that CNN report that said that he was nervous, I had thought that was standard issue expectations management. No, I believe it now. I think Walz looked nervous. I think he looked within a few minutes. He realized he was 2 or 3 months ago this relatively obscure Democratic governor who was going to be in that job, like he's term limited, but he's never had.
And Jim, may I interrupt you?
Sure.
2 months ago, he had gotten away with 20 years of fabulous, of just lying. 20 years of not being fact-checked. And that ends when you become a vice presidential nominee.
I know you were screaming at your television last night saying, where is the real question about China? The only tough question that Walz got on China was, hey, you said you were in Hong Kong for Tiananmen Square, but you didn't get there till months later. What happened? And he offered 2 straight minutes of flop sweat and talking about everything except the question he was answered. And then afterwards, he's like, yeah, I totally misremembered. I'm a knucklehead sometimes. Well, I'm a knucklehead. Put me a heartbeat away from the presidency to be commander-in-chief in a dangerous world.
Jim, you must have had my room bugged because apparently the name Xi Jinping is Voldemort for networks with our compromised by China ties. I cannot believe we had 3 hours of debate between the 4 candidates and his name did not come up.
I also note last night, no question on Russia-Ukraine. Iran and Israel was the only foreign policy question. And I think we got a whole, the stakes of the debate. Look, vice presidential debates traditionally don't make a very big difference. But we had about a month's worth of news on Tuesday between Iran attacking Israel and Israel going to retaliate at some point. The longshoreman strike, which is going to have they didn't have a question about that. I give them credit about that. And the response to the hurricane. And I noticed the question about the hurricane was a climate change question. It was not a, hey, what do you think of the administration's response? The president's barely been out there. And when he was asked about the strikes in the Middle East, and he apparently misheard the question and thought it was about the strikes of the longshoremen. We have a real dearth of leadership in this country. And I think that kind of made last night a little more important. Also, the fact that
I also want to point out, George Bush got hammered on Katrina for flying over in the picture.
Yeah.
We have the Kamala picture with the unplugged in phone and it doesn't come up. It's just like CBS and ABC. They're broken.
I was on the phone for 2 hours yesterday. It's called a telephone. Yeah. You whippersnapper.
You're not Dana Carvey. No joke.
Dana Carvey doing the great Biden is basically his grumpy old man character from the 1990s. And it's the same guy. Yep. It is the same irritable, lost train of thought. And another thing, by the way, Carvey's masterful at this stuff.
And the rich need to pay their amount.
He was the only safe target for SNL.
Yep. Now let's just drop back for a second. Did that change the dynamics of the presidential election? Because I think Trump's going to win, and I think it marginally contributed in Pennsylvania.
First of all, I think it vividly demonstrated the opportunity cost of not picking Josh Shapiro, because it would irritate Democrats who are upset with Israel. And what I mean by Israel is Jews. Let's just be clear.
Jews.
Shapiro, look, I don't know how Shapiro would have done in the debate. I think he probably would have been better than that.
A lot better.
They said by the transitive property, Walz was going to help all across the upper Midwest. Well, Michigan is neck and neck. Wisconsin is neck and neck. Maybe a small lead for Harris, but it's not outside the margin of error. And Pennsylvania's neck and neck. So what does Walz bring to the ticket besides Diet Mountain Dew?
The knucklehead vote. He's going to get Matt Gaetz's vote. They both are knuckleheads. Jim Garrity, I'm going to go listen to the editors. I hope you do a 3 Martini Lunch, both great podcasts. Follow Jim at Jim Garrity. He's going to write this up at the Washington Post as well.